Welcome back to the Wine Tech Insiders podcast. Today we're going to talk about the wine startup debate it's been going on the last little bit, wine brands for sale and wine sounds, and a little bit about naked wines. This is episode 37. I'd like to welcome back our insiders, Laurie from Oushinery.
Hi.
Nick from Wine Owners.
Hello.
And Seb from Troly, who's just on audio today.
Good morning, boys and girls, live from a Spanish beach for you today.
Okay, let's get going. So the debate continues. There was another article about are wine startups good investments? Why don't investors like them? Should they like them? They make a couple of main points. They say the industry is opaque, highly regulated, and exhibits few success stories. A few massive players block the rest. And there's a lot of product complexity. Nick, what do you think? Is this true? Is there a lot of truth into that, or is this just an opportunity? What's your experience?
Well, there's definitely a lot of product complexity. We all know that, particularly as you go a little bit further up the tree, then you really don't have a standardized system of being able to code and recognize products as you do, within a classic CPG market. And yes, there is complexity within the market in the US, and yes, the market is dominated from some very large suppliers in the US. But I still think that even in the US, there are gaps in the market that are unfilled as yet. There's clearly been a lot of plays around platforms. Provi, a very good example, who've obviously done very well and absorbed 750, and also clearly lots of activity in the whole sort of D2C area. So I still think that there's plenty of opportunity in the US where you're really clear about what problem is that you're solving and where you're able to realize real value as a result of that. I think looking broader and looking internationally, yes, of course, there's still complexity around product, but it's not rocket science. It's not anything that can't be dealt with by an underlying referential database, for example. It's really not rocket science. I think there's plenty of opportunity in the wine, spirits, alcohol, retail distribution market, which remains somewhat untapped. And I think investors will put money into business opportunities where the case is really clearly articulated and where it is really obvious what the value chain looks like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I really love what you mentioned, Nick. Like, I think a lot of those articles are very centered on the US and their unique, 3-tier system. And I mean, I count Canada in that as well, but I think we need to think like more globally as well. And you just stole like my line, oh, it is not rocket science. Like there is literally people, working on like, I don't want to talk Elon Musk, but like, getting to Mars and everything. Like there are a complex problem that like it needs solving. Like in the case of the wine industry, it's just like it can be solved. It has its own challenges, but also if there was no problem, there would be also like no work for us, right? Like it exists an opportunity also like fixing those issues why all of us on that call exist. So there is problem equals opportunity. And I think being very clear for investors or for the companies themselves, the businesses, just like what it is that we are solving and like the value behind it. Like, is it like the typical, like, are we just like a painkiller, which is most likely what you want to be, or just a vitamin? Like, like I think like the vitamin like plays. What I mean by vitamin is like more like a nice to have. Oh, it's nice to have, where to know where to buy this bottle of wine I'm thinking of. Like, it's nice to have. Is it crucial to the consumer? That I don't know. Like, like that's that kind of like level as well. So yeah, I still think there's a lot of opportunity, but I think maybe one of the issues that I see as well with the wine industry is maybe, and we've discussed about that before as well, is how very insular or in its own bubble it can be because of all this regulation. And it feels maybe sometimes we are trying to, and I'm counting, myself in this, like with Oushinery, but to sometimes like totally wanting to reinvent the wheel when some other industries are like, well, we kind of solve that. And this more like this adaptation or like just like how do we make it work for our industry without necessarily like starting fully from scratch. I think it's finding that balance and maybe speaking to investors beyond maybe the wine industry as well. Like I don't have the answer or the solution, but it's really like, oh, there is a world of CPG that is massively varied on its own, and then there is wine. Wine can be totally different, but in the general consumer, I'm not talking like fine wine or, at the end of the day, they buy that bottle of wine at the Tesco just the same way that they bought that, it ends up in the same basket, right? Like when they bring the pasta, they bring the the pasta sauce, and they bring the red bottle of wine to go with it. So it's just kind of like interesting how possibly in the eye of the consumer, like it might not be always such a different product category. Seb, anything to add?
Look, I think it's an absolutely fascinating topic because we've seen recently with PICS, basically more or less, raising the flag. The whole idea is that as an investor, if you come to me and you've just figured out a way of selling glasses direct to consumers, as a mass-produced consumer goods, you can ship a pair of glasses, you can ship a mattress, you can ship shoes throughout the entire of the US without any heavy regulation. Whereas as a business, if your aim is to ship throughout the US, if you want to ship wine or alcohol, generally speaking, look, you're $500,000 to $1 million in legal cost, in company and subsidiaries creation costs, before you can actually ship legally, right? I mean, a bunch of wineries will ship illegally, which is fine. That's a different topic. But as an investor, the idea of having to sink $500,000 to $1 million in just the setup of the shipping capability, it's not rocket science. It's feasible. It's absolutely fine. But that's also where a lot of investors kind of go, look, it's not really it's not putting money to good use, right? As opposed to glasses where you can start selling 100,000, 500,000, 1 million glasses very scalably. Wine doesn't scale as easily. So there is, I think, a number of arguments for saying, look, there's not that many wine businesses who have been properly funded in the American kind of definition of, funding to grow, funding to build, funding to disrupt. And the sole exception, in my mind, would be Vivino. And if you look at Vivino and the amount of cash that they raise and where they raised it from, their primary investors are not American. They're out of Europe. And so they do have a good presence, a good brand in the US, but ultimately these were investors who probably didn't really understand as much the complexity of shipping wine through the US, right? So American investors, I do think, are potentially not, the appetite for wine businesses is potentially not as high, as big. The opportunities, look, they're there. The challenge with the opportunities is, in my opinion, the fragmentation. You're looking at 94 to 97% of producers being small businesses. So if you're a Vivino of the world, if you're a Naked Wine of the world, if you're a business trying to move a whole lot of wine, you cannot talk to a single supplier. You cannot talk to, a handful of suppliers. You need to talk to thousands of suppliers to have enough scalability in your product. So there's a number of challenges. There's definitely a number of challenges, and I do believe that there's a lack of appetite towards wine-only or wine-centric businesses, primarily in the US, and then the capital, the VC-style market in Europe, is a whole different ballgame, really. It's a whole different level, lower level.
Yeah, I mean, you say that, but there's a lot of money that is going into all types of tech covering wine and other alcohol businesses in the US. You know, a lot of it is relatively small scale. Maybe that's a factor. But there is,
yeah, 100%.
You know, there is an investor who is interested by the fact that it's difficult, who is interested by the fact that the market is complex, that is therefore interested in the idea that if a business is able to crack a particular set of problems, that's then a very defensible position within the market, because it's harder than in many other sectors for other businesses to come in and compete.
Yeah, I mean, the clearly cracking this is a significant value add, right? For a business to be able to just, you know, sell a proposition, sell the fact that they can ship wine throughout the US. It's clearly valuable, but the number of hurdles, again, they're not impossible, but there is a number of hurdles. And look, the subjectivity of the product, I think Laurie kind of touched on the fact that there is a significant amount of the market who buy their wine at Trader Joe for $2.99. It's not necessarily the most interesting part of a segment of the market, according to many of us, but at the same time, it is significant. And when you look at consumer goods around wine,
that's a CPG market, then, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Essentially, yes, correct. And when you look at the raw goods, not the drinks, but you look at, you know, the wine stoppers and the drinks, and there's been some, I can remember one a couple of years ago, a sleeve that you would put on top of an aluminum bottle, and you have a full experience of the wine on the screen and the bottle. There's been a couple of consumer-driven kind of initiatives to try and help discover the wine. But none of them have been able to really scale, given the subjectivity and the complexity of the product, right? If you appreciate a $10 wine, well, who's to say that it's not a great drink, you know? So yeah, look, there's very few examples of absolutely outstanding case studies in the world of wine. And it's not, I don't think investors are all necessarily dumb, not seeing the opportunities. I think ultimately a lot of them have done their homeworks, and it just kind of went, look, feasible, but cost benefit, it's a bit tight. It's a passion industry, and we're all passionate about it. That's why we want to change it. If there's a buck to be made out of it, great. But I think there's far more of an interest into the industry, far more than a strong, solid, crazy, scalable business case, you know.
Well, there was news about one startup in the wine world, Naked Wines, who is now has a revenue of about 350 million pounds and a 75 million pound market cap. They cut 6% of the workforce, essentially in an effort to break even. Now, we haven't talked a lot about Naked Wines. It's an interesting and started off as a unique concept. Nick, you're our local. Naked's originally is from the UK and has moved to the US. What give us your insight into Naked Wines?
Well, you know, they've been around for a while. They kind of, I guess they started out as Virgin Wines and then kind of came Naked as they sort of built out the platform and kind of conceived of the sort of idea of customers being angels supporting these amazing kind of diamonds in the rough that have been that were hitherto undiscovered, and that somehow they could fund these small independent producers and bring their wines to market in a way that would otherwise not be possible. So the storytelling was incredible, and I think it's clearly a very compelling business positioning. And you know, 350 million suggests that you know, it's a popular proposition. So you know, that's great. I mean, it's very much a model targeting a certain group of people, certain groups of people, and with a portfolio of wines that are blended and designed to appeal to a a certain set of palates. So, you know, they're easy drinking, they're round, they're juicy, they're full of fruit, and you know, it does, and they do, you know, that works very well. And I guess what the numbers suggest is that the cost of marketing, the cost of customer acquisition is probably quite high, and understandably so. And clearly there has been, I guess, a period of time where that business did pursue growth at all costs, because, you know, that's implicit in what the new CEO is saying, in that they shan't continue to pursue growth at all costs going forward, which is why they are trimming some of their costs. I mean, we're not talking about a massive, you know, we're not talking about you know, a bloodbath here. We're talking about an adjustment in their cost base. So yeah, I wish them well.
Then from an e-commerce kind of point of view, what do you think what have they done well, and what do you think of Naked Wines?
Look, I think overall, the as Nick mentioned, they started out with a really interesting concept of a wine angel, where the consumer would actually, quote, invest money into a winemaker. The winemaker would get paid or partially paid to actually make and design a wine to be delivered to the angels, the consumers. I think one thing they've done really well is that they quickly realized that this didn't really scale all that well. And started having some wines increasingly designed exclusively for Naked Wine. And that's how, my understanding of it, that's how their margins are probably higher than the likes of Vivino, hence why they have a significant amount of revenue, right? Because I'm not sure of the exact post-COVID numbers of Vivino, but in the 300 mil kind of a range is roughly where Vivino, 300, 350 is roughly where Vivino is at. So it basically brings Naked Wine as being more or less the same size of a business as Vivino. But Vivino is just a marketplace, a bit more scalable perhaps, but also their margins would be a bit lower as opposed to Naked Wine, who was able to adapt to the reality of the lack of scalability in the industry. And they've leaned onto their e-commerce and wine design exclusively for them, leaned onto their ability to sell a pretty decent story, and they've just grown e-commerce sales. And I can see right now the whole sort of a technology readjustment at large. A lot of technology companies have grown tremendously through COVID. And now they're kind of basically saying, look, the economy is, okay, it's going to be a bit bumpy over the next few months. And we do have some costs that we're able to cut, might as well, right? Facebook has done the same thing. Google has announced a few things as well. So everyone is more or less trying to play it a bit safer than we did, 2, 5, 10 years ago.
Laurie, have you ever ordered from Naked Wines or?
No, I haven't actually. I was just like, oh, I know I've talked to them and like maybe
you're not a good angel.
No, like a year and a half ago, and like the conversation was already very much around like optimizing costs, which I know every business should be, but it was really interesting how they were like doing their math and calculation and how precious they were with the dollars on like the photography side of things. So just kind of like curious to see a little bit, how it's divided, and it's interesting to see that they are reducing, from what I've read, like a bit like their outreach that way. That's something that we're seeing a lot with like this bigger, like wine businesses, like things like First Leaf or Wink, in the US, just like any, really like those like marketplaces style businesses. It's just like, well, we need to generate profit now. So like slashing or being more targeted with customer acquisition and like the budget behind it. So I'm really curious to see how it's going to maybe like change a little bit their approach to marketing. That's something I will be monitoring quite closely, actually.
Well, speaking of marketing and $2 Chuck, which you mentioned before, Seb, there was a great article about brands and what wine brands are worth. And if we look at the case of Two Buck Chuck, that is nicknamed after Charles F. Shaw, who was essentially a failed winemaker and had to shut down in the early 90s. And his brand, his name was bought by the Bronco Wine Company, who then turned it into Charles Shaw Wines, and that was coined by an employee of Trader Joe's, where they were selling it for $2. I think now it's more, but this is interesting idea of the value of brands, and brands are, I know, important to bottle books. They're important to the wine industry. Laurie, you probably know more about brands than anybody else. What does that mean? What does it mean to your customers? What does it mean to a label to have that brand? What is the value of a brand for a wine?
It's crazy important. Branding, like brand recognition. We see brands in the US like Josh, or the one that kind of like signature. I think what's interesting is putting your own name on it. Is obviously, as we see, like a double-edged sword, and we're seeing it in the wine industry. But I want to say, like, even if you go other industry, like, I know it's a little bit out there, but in the world of cosmetic, like Bobbi Brown was a famous makeup artist that created her own line, and then she sold, and now she has to create a new brand. And the Bobbi Brown, her name again, like they're having issues, their quality control of makeup, her name's still on it, but she's not part of the company for like 10 years, so it's like, it's happening in the wine industry predominantly, but it's also happening in other categories. I always said, for me, like when I work with clients in my design practice, I try to really steer them away from using their own name. It's just because it's often not meaningful enough to also the average consumer. And then when it becomes meaningful, like in those cases, then that's when you kind of like lose that name. So if anything, if you have to put a name on it, I would go more like in the direction of like Josh or alike, which is actually a made up name that has where you keep owning the story without, that would be something that I would be watch out for. I think when names make a lot of sense, and I think Nick would agree, is when there is genuinely a history behind it, and maybe history more with a bigger H. Like just like past, like we're talking like hundreds of years, or like at least, like a real history, and there's a bit more meaning behind it than just, Chateau Milhaud, in my case, kind of thing like that. It's very tricky. There's no easy answer, but I always caution using, for new brands, especially, like your family name. It's a tough hill to get recognized, and then it can cut you off. Unless, of course, you have Francis Ford Coppola, then your name already has another significance, and of course, I go for it. There's always exceptions to the rule. Like, I'm sure, Nick, you have your own point of view on names and on label.
Well, I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask. I mean, when I started out my business 10 years ago, and we were focused on the wine collector, we called it wine owners. So, not probably the most imaginative brand creator in the whole world.
Well,
look, I've got to say, it's interesting. Ultimately, in the world of wine, when it comes to brands, we're not really seeing the amount of recognitions winemakers could be getting. The brands being created are usually brands creating and marketing a product, especially in the US. Like, even if it's a family name, a lot of those small wineries actually buy grapes. They buy the juice. They don't even grow the grapes. And so ultimately, there's an amount of scalability there. They use contract winemakers to design a wine to their likings, or the way that they think it's going to sell in the market. So ultimately, the brand is more or less the only value in the brand is into pulling everything together and actually selling and creating a recognizable name, right? But look, there is no such thing as a Michael Jordan in the world of wine, where Michael Jordan has sold his name to actually sign basketball balls. He sold his name to put onto jerseys. He sold his name to put it on shoes. You look at the world of celebrity chefs, where their names are being put onto gear, onto shows, onto recipe books, onto so many things. I don't think the parallel is the same in the world of wine. And the story of sort of a $2 Chuck, I'm aware from distant memories that the original guy didn't want to make cheap wines, and the person who, or the entity who bought it, just made cheap, affordable wines, and he didn't like that. Well, if you've built a business out of thin air and you're building a brand out of thin air and you're capable of just selling it because someone else is recognizing value out of it, well, kind of tough, right? You're just getting a couple of $1 million and your name is going to be used and recognized moving forward. You might not be able to start another wine business called the same thing, but call it something else, right? I don't think it's such a big problem using your name. And the recognizability, look, it takes time to build a family business where the name is actually being recognized. But in the world of like a small producer making, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 cases, I can tell you for sure each and every customer recognizes the name of that winery, even if it's a family name or the animal, the pet dog's name or the property name or whatever that name is. So it's the idea the brand itself basically carries in itself no real value. It's really the pulling everything together that carries value and makes the brand recognizable and valuable.
There was also a great article about sound in wine, how sound can influence what you taste. A bunch of a number of wineries are considering this in their tasting room and have specifically designed sounds, music to listen to while you're tasting wine. I guess it's like everything else in the atmosphere when you're drinking. Yeah, Laurie, do you have a favorite piece of music that you listen to drink wine to, or are there memories of that? Does that ring a bell?
Like for me, wine is enjoyed like in a social environment. So I would say more like the chat, the chatter, like conversations, like kind of like surrounding usually like a good meal or a good aperitif. I may not be the best example, but usually that's where I actually would be more spontaneous, and that's where I would let Spotify. Like typically for when I work, I always know the playlist that I curated that I would be listening to. When I go more like to like drinking and eating, I'm a bit more willing personally to like take a gamble, and I would just search Spotify by mood and kind of then look at so I guess it is sensorial. Like I would look at the cover of the playlist that other people have curated and just be like, yeah, click this and like listen to music that I've actually never listened to. I never thought about it.
Should wineries make a Spotify playlist for every wine that they have?
Absolutely. Like I think that's where bars and restaurants are actually way better at this. Like they often create playlists that they then make available, obviously, for their patrons. And I'm actually even seeing it. There is this this brand right now called Fable, which does dinerware, glassware. Made in Portugal, sold in the United States. It's a venture-backed company, like that. They're growing really quite fast. And every month, as part of the newsletter, we're talking plates and cups here, right? They will share a Spotify playlist of the moment. Here's what we're listening to when we are designing the latest cup. There's definitely like a marketing aspect to it, like no denial. But we are cooking and we're listening to this. But it's also such a fun way to just get attached to the brand. There's a Fable logo, you're listening to it on Spotify. There's no ads, it's not intrusive. And I actually genuinely look forward to receiving their email because I'm tired of my own Spotify playlist and the algorithm doesn't quite work. So I think it could really be an opportunity there. Yeah. I don't know if it drives more.
I think you're highlighting that wine is an experience, not necessarily a product, or it's really an experience, and anything to augment that experience the more the better, right? And I agree that music, look, is wine better with a certain piece of music? I don't think so. But from a marketing and an experiential kind of angle, absolutely. Anything. Look, I could kind of see a button on the bottle where you can listen to the song that the winemaker was listening to when they were making the wine. 100%. Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah, it's fun. It's just another way of connecting, and we had that in common, or just, like, I don't know, like it just, and it's non-intrusive as well. Not ads, it's not, but it's branded. Like, I think, and it's super cheap. I mean, creating playlists on Spotify. I mean, I know Spotify, people have to pay for it, but like it's also, it costs nothing. I kind of like, now that I'm finishing that code, I'm like, oh, maybe I should do an Oushinery playlist and just share it to my, to my own like email list. Like it just, yeah, I may pin that actually. I think it's quite fun.
I will look out for that. That sounds cool, Laurie. That'll be the highlight of my week.
We'll share it at the next podcast, which will be back in a few weeks. Thank you everyone for listening to the Wine Tech Insiders podcast. Listen to the next one because Laurie's Spotify playlist will be linked in it. I want to thank Laurie, I want to thank Nick, and I want to thank Seb. We'll see you all in a few weeks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, David.
See you guys. Looking forward to the playlist.